Hey everybody, Jeremy Lord here again, and we're doing another solo live stream, except this time my background's a little bit different. I'm actually at Adobe Studios in Sydney, and I've got Flynn and Joe here doing the works in the background. And you're joining us for the second episode of my three-part series on pixel art. So thanks for joining in. We've got a chat going as well. Make sure to ask some questions as well if you can. That's always like love to kind of answer your questions on pixel art and anything else really. But yeah, I thought I'd get it started today on just a little recap in case you missed or forgot what we kind of spoke about last week. And then we can get into today's stream where we're going to start adding some color and values to what we did last week, basically. So last week we started with this little kind of scene that we created using Photoshop and pixel art to create this little character. Lots of different concepts happening, setting up files, getting your pixel dimensions correct. Started from this little sketch, brought that in, and we created this little guy, this little sprite with just basic line work. And we also covered a few different concepts with pixel art, looking at things like good pixels and bad pixels and good line work. So things like this are like doubling up, what we call doubling up, where there's pixels that are going to go on the corners. You will see will dramatically change the way a shape kind of behaves and looks in your pixel art. And it's not a good thing to do. So they were just some of the main concepts that we looked at last week. But yeah, now we're going to get into the kind of the meat of things. We've got our line work, which, by the way, you don't actually have to color any of this stuff. If your line work's expressive enough, you could definitely leave this little guy as is. And if you were thinking of animating this quite extensively, you might want to consider actually leaving this in line work because it makes it a lot easier to do if it's just the line work. But we're going to add some colors into this. We're going to have a little bit more fun and start kind of working around with this. So let me jump into the final form of this guy. And what I've got up here is you can see I've got this like palette of, it's actually upside down. I don't know why that says low. It should say 10, but there you go. Might just need to move a pixel around. What I've got is 10, 20, 45, 65, and 85. You can kind of forget the 10 exists for now. We can just focus on the 25, 45, and 65. So what I'm going to be doing here is I'm actually going to be working in gray first, and then I'm going to be adding some colors through gradient maps. And it's a really easy way to work and kind of limit your colors in pixel art, because obviously the whole point of pixel art is it's kind of lo-fi. You don't want billions of colors in there. You want to keep it a little bit kind of lo-fi and retro, so you want to limit your colors for the look. But also, it just makes your life a bit easier when you're picking colors. If you've got a relatively restricted color palette, it just makes things a little bit easier going forward. So what I've got here is basically, I've got a little bit of an extreme, and if we bring back the 10 here, I've just got an extra one for the line work. But what I've kind of done is I've taken the extremes of like 100 being like full black and then 0 being full white, right? We've got this grayscale there, and I've done 4 sets of tones, so 1 on both extremes, and then 2 in the middle that kind of sit nice and evenly through. So we've got 20, 45, 65, and 85. Why not 0 or 100, or in this case 0 to get full black, and then 45, 65, and then 100? Because if you use those extremes of full black and full white, it kind of creates a little bit too much contrast. It's a little bit hard to see, and it kind of pops in your eye a little bit. So we've just brought those extremes back in a little bit, down to 85. You could also do 90 if you wanted. And then on the other side, we've got 20. And I've added in a 10 later on for line work, and you'll see how that goes. But I don't want this to be full black. And if I drop this and double click on it, you'll see that that's not going all the way down to complete black. It's just on the black at 10%, right? So we're going to use that to basically kind of create a little bit of a swatch. So let me drag this down a little bit closer to my guy here. And I'm going to go to my layer here, my toon, and I've got a layer underneath my line work ready to go. Whoops, and you can see I've actually done this before, but That's just so we can kind of speed things up a little bit. But I'll show you guys the principle of how we can kind of do this. So first and foremost, we want to block in main kind of sets of tones, right? And I could actually do this on the layer that I've got on my toon. It depends on what you want to be using, right? You could do this with the paint bucket tool. If you were on that layer, because we've got nice clean pixels, make sure that our paint bucket is on anti-alias up here. So paint bucket and a bunch of other selection tools, we can cover that a little bit more later on. Need to be on anti-alias, because otherwise if you don't, you get what's happened here where you can see it's created some pixels outside of my line work because Photoshop's trying to smooth that down for me. So untick that, and now you can see that that's nice and clean. It's just hitting those zones inside of my pixel art. So if you're going to use the paint bucket, you could just do it straight up onto the line work. If you're a little bit worried or your line work's a little bit too intricate, you can just do it on a layer underneath and do it that way. So we're going to do it on the actual toon layer because I'm feeling pretty confident and we don't have heaps of time, so I'm just going to use the paint bucket. So what I'm doing here is basically just blocking in main tones, right? And because I've got a relatively simple and limited color palette, that's actually going to be quite easy for me. What I'm going to do as well, just so you can kind of see, because we can see the pixel grid here, we can see the lines on that grid. I'm actually going to go up to View, Show, and then untick Pixel Grid. And that's just going to give me a bit more of a flatter, like what it's actually going to appear like on screen or on print or whatever you're doing with this. Just makes it a little bit easier to work with. The other thing that you'll notice is that my background isn't actually completely white. There is a little bit of a tone to it, but that's okay. We can fix that a little bit later on. So I'm going to continue here working to this particular background and just making sure that my little character here makes sense from a tonal value. And this is the key to why I'm actually working with these tones, is with this kind of tone of grayscale, is to make sure that I'm actually working with nice values and I'm not going to be, you're not going to have any problems later on. You can see my spoiler alert here of what I've kind of done with this, but yeah, I kind of just want to make sure that I've got something working relatively well for everything when I actually decide to put some color into this. So this is again just me kind of blocking in colors. If I want to, I can also bring in a sense of highlights, right? So I can bring in, just start thinking about how the light's going to kind of hit this character, bring in some volume, increase the clarity of the shapes, and just make sure overall that everything's looking nice and clean and how I want it. All right. So already you can see that there's a little bit more kind of meat on this character. So let me fast forward here a little bit and just get rid of these guys. And I can show you guys what this looks like in the end results of this. I probably should have done this on a separate layer for this, but that's okay. So obviously I'm using an eraser and a brush here that are set to pencil mode. So if you missed last week, that's one of the, obviously probably the most important thing to consider when you are creating pixel art is setting your tools to the right mode. And in this case, we want to swap from a brush to the pencil, and we want to swap the eraser from the brush mode to a pencil mode as well. All right, so here we go. We've got our character all kind of figured out. You can see here in my colors or in my tones, I've actually done a little bit of what's called dithering, more on that later, on the tail, just to kind of show a little bit of texture here. So there is some consideration put into this. It's not just flat colors. You can see I've got some highlights, and I've got a little bit of texture on the fur here and on the straw hat. But otherwise, it's looking pretty good. So up close, this looks like a dog's breakfast. from a distance, and you do want to be working from a distance when you're doing pixel art because that's the whole point. You're going to be seeing these characters really small on your screen. It makes a little bit more sense. All the volume starts to come out. Even the kind of lack of contrast on the belt here starts to make a little bit more sense. Now, I've got something really cartoony here, and something that's kind of working quite well. But if you were working in different ways, and you can see here I've added in some colors, but what I've kind of prepared for you is this idea of what are the different line work styles that you can do when you're kind of creating pixel art. So when you are creating this, obviously you want to think about like your pixel size and everything, something I spoke about last week, but there's also a sense of kind of like graphic illustration style that you want to think about that might work better or not for you. So in this instance, we've got just the line work. Then we've got line work with some tones. Then we've got basically what I created before, which is the line work with some colors. And then this is what I'm kind of working on as a full, right? We've got the same thing, but the line work has got a different color to it as well. And it's something that's offsetting the oranges. So blue and orange, complementary colors. So that kind of colored line work is working quite well. And then we can push that even kind of further into this much more kind of painterly thing where there kind of is no outline here. We're not getting that comic book vibe. This feels a little bit more painterly because what's happening is the outline is matching the color to what it's outlining effectively, right? So here I've got these orange sleeves. So I've got a darker orange and a lighter orange to outline and kind of give a sense of volume in here. This is really cool if you're working on a smaller kind of pixel density artwork, right? And you can't afford to bring in an actual line work around something that's going to make it very tricky to use, all right? So consider always kind of working with different outlines and what that's going to mean for your artwork and for the overall style of your piece. There's probably more outlines that you could play around with and working with pixel art, which is one of the super fun things that I really like to do. But yeah, we can kind of see where we're going to go with this. I'm pretty sure I'm going to stick to this one. And again, we're working in black and white for now, but I think that's working pretty well. So let's give this guy a little bit of a world to live in and think about the tones and things that we're going to create, right? Okay, so let's start maybe with getting a little bit of like a floor here, right? Let's get a ground level in here and we can kind of give him a little bit of a platform because we're doing a bit of a side scroller, platformer kind of game. So we're going to give him a bit of ground to sit on. We can just kind of round that thing off down there and then bring it in, holding down shift to the side here. So now he's got a little bit of kind of something to stand on. He's just kind of floating in midair. And I've not done the corner pixels here. Again, if I did, you can see how different that's going to look. Now it's going to be a nice kind of clear cut, straight off the bat kind of thing. If I just round off those corners, it just has a little bit of a rounded edge, feels a little bit softer, less kind of two-dimensional, if you will. So we can work with something like this, and then we can give him a little bit of a, like, that kind of platform. Again, you know, what environment is he going to be standing in? How do we kind of work with something like this? So what I want to do is I kind of actually want to give him this kind of stone repeat pattern to work to, right? Because I feel like it's going to kind of work quite well, and it's going to be something that's going to give me a little bit of a Japanese vibe. So that's obviously a repeat pattern, but it's not a tile. So you want to avoid being able to see the tiles. Seeing a repetition is fine because obviously it's a pattern. It's something that you're using as an asset, right? But what we're looking at is basically looking at something like this. So let me show you how to do this a little bit and kind of work to a pattern that's going to be able to be used as this kind of set of kind of blocks that we can use, but not have it be obvious where the kind of the links in between these two line up, if you will. So here's what we're going to do. I've got a set here at 32 by 32 pixels, right? 32 because it's a nice multiple of 2, right? So 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and so on. So it's a nice kind of binary system that we've set up. And also it splits in half, nice and easy. So making sure that this is set at a pixel size that you can split in half is going to be paramount for this. And then basically what I can do is I could make a tile, right? So let's say that I'm going to start kind of drawing in here, and I'm going to make these kind of tiles, but I'm just going to fit them inside my kind of pattern here. They're not going to go over to the edge. They're just going to sit nice and comfortably. By the way, I'm using a mouse here. It's one of the joys of pixel art is you could do this with a trackpad, you could do this with a mouse. It doesn't necessarily require having a potentially expensive drawing tablet or anything else to do. So it makes it actually quite accessible if you're thinking of getting into something like this, but not sure what you need. You actually don't need these kinds of things at all. You can just do it with a mouse, which is kind of fun. But let's say that I'm happy with this, right? And I'm just going to repeat this pattern. So let me smash these down. I'm just going to take this and drag it into my, into my file here. And what you'll see is if I take this and repeat it, it's not going to look great. Like you can see where the pattern kind of stops and ends, right? We're getting a pattern, but it's not a nice kind of clean, seamless pattern is what we're kind of going for. So what I need to do with this is go back into my thing here and make sure that I'm not necessarily getting too close to the edges. So let me undo that, create a new layer. In fact, I'm just going to delete all of this stuff, and we can just start thinking about putting some kind of shapes in the middle here. I might just make my brush bigger so you can kind of see what I'm doing. I'm just going to do this very roughly. And I will actually, for this one, go off to the edges and also go above and beyond the sides here. All right. Then I'm going to go to Filter, Other, make sure I'm on the right layer. I am. Filter, Other, Offset. All right. Now, what I want to do here is I want to do a horizontal and a vertical offset. And I want it to be half of my canvas. So I want things to move up and down and offset it by half. So I need to do 16 by, 16. And there we go. All right. Now what I can do is it's kind of shifted. It's obviously changed my design every like part of it. But what I can do is I can come in and fill the gaps that I've left out in between here. As long as I don't touch the edges, as long as I don't go overlapping on the edges, I should be okay. Now, if I take this and bring it into my piece here and repeat this, what you'll notice is everything lines up on the left and right, but also on the top and bottom. All right? So I've got this nice kind of tile where you can't really see a seam if you do it a little bit better than what I did in kind of a rush here, but that offset tool allows you to create kind of like a little bit of a pattern without it being too obvious that that's what you've done. And that's what I've kind of done with this particular pattern here. You can see is I've just taken this in, and it's literally just that and then repeated left and right. I just need to make sure that it lines up. Yep. And then top and bottom. And now you get a nice kind of clean, seamless pattern that you can just reuse as you want. Now what you'll notice is I've got a folder here with a bunch of sprites in this, and what is happening with this is it's actually going to give me a bunch of assets and tools that I can reuse later on. So you can see I've got this. I've also got a more kind of like a brick layer. I've got some grass here as well. So I created this little thing with grass. And what I can do is I can take this guy and I can duplicate it and bring it into my environment layer here. So I don't need these guys, I need the sprite. Bring it into the environment, stick it on the actual ground, which is right here. And then I can use it to duplicate it. So that sits on top of there. And then I can just click and drag to duplicate that. And because I'm working to a nice kind of even grid, which I've turned on here, you can see I've actually kind of matched it all up. I can actually very quickly create a grass layer, right? So it's just that repetition of a grass layer. And then I come in with that at the end here, just kind of a little bit of a knock on, just as an asset there to make it look kind of like the grass is going over the edge. And then I can also just bring in some weeds, just a little bit more organically scattered throughout. This is not a pattern, it's not a thing that you can reuse. We're not making a video game here to do this, so we don't need to necessarily think about not using one-offs. But we've got something that's looking quite good already, and just kind of this little character is kind of sitting on this. So now what I would do is I would just spend some time kind of creating more assets, right? So I've got this lamp here that I've created that's got a little bit of an outline, and then I have filled it using my kind of color palette that I've created, right? I've got a little bit of a direction of light happening here, again, just to give it a little bit more volume, give it a bit more depth. What you'll notice as well is that here my outline is potentially going to be problematic. So I might do a kind of a half outline on something like this, whereby I'm actually going to erase this section of the outline. And it's going to make a pretty big difference if you look at this being kind of like solid in the outline versus this feels a little bit more organic. So you don't feel like you need to block everything out with an outline. It also means if I leave that in, that my little windows in this lantern here, the little paper sections, the bottom one isn't the same amount of pixels, which is a bit problematic. So I just need to do this and we're pretty good with that. Then the same thing happens with, I've got a kind of a Torii gate here. Now this I've created using Symmetry Tool. So obviously you want to kind of decrease the amount of work that you do. So if you turn on a Symmetry Tool like this, you can start to draw in some basic kind of lines. And again, trying to avoid doubling up on pixels, we can start to get some angles. And obviously that's just gonna make my workflow a hell of a lot easier going forward, and just making sure that everything's nice and seamless with the assets that I create. So again, I'm not gonna do this whole thing here, but you can very easily see how that is super fast to create these kind of symmetrical assets without too much kind of hassle. And then the same thing is going to apply, same principle basically is going to apply for all the other shapes that go in here. So let me get rid of my color palette that I created here, just so you can see what we're doing, and go down, and I've got a fill for this Torii gate. Yeah. Then I've created a little shrine inside that can live, like maybe a little kind of a little extra life can live in there. It's a shrine, you go and kind of do a thing and it gives you a little bit of health, it blesses you. Same thing, you know, working with these levels of gray is going to make it a hell of a lot easier for me to kind of figure out what color stuff is. Because if you're working straight up in color, you might have some clashing colors. You might have to figure out what the tones are. The values might not work particularly well. Restricting yourself to black and white or grayscale in this instance just makes your life a whole lot easier. In some instances, it can also make it a little bit difficult because you're a little bit limited. But for the result that we're going for, it does work super, super well to kind of work this way. Now let's bring in a few more kind of elements that we've got in the background. So we're going to lock this up with a little kind of Mount Fuji up here. We've also got some mountains, so mountains with trees, mountains without trees, depending on. You can see obviously on the sides here, it's a bit of a dog's breakfast, but that is because I have created a little bit of a tree here that goes there, that kind of blocks that out. Again, my tree is cherry blossom, working with the same tones. We've got some petals kind of falling down throughout this. A little bit of a graphic style up here. So this can be super fun to work with. And it's a great spot for me to show you guys how these kind of graphic styles work. So I've gone with something a little bit more organic, less kind of patterny, but you could do something quite graphic here and add in like these actual little kind of sakura blossoms. Some of them might be bigger than others, so we're gonna go 2 squares by 2 squares and just do these little kind of crosses everywhere that will, from a distance, look like flowers. So again, you could do this quite a bit, but it will give your artwork a little bit more of a graphic, stylized vibe, which I'm not really going for on this. I've gone for something a little bit more like plain in style, I guess, a little bit more realistic. So we're not going to do that. But again, you could do this. You know, you could make your sakura blossom tree could literally be these like blocks of kind of pixels, and they just kind of sit on this tree, and the tree is itself this kind of like very weird and kind of geometric shape. Again, it really depends on what you're going for, right? So we've got our sakura tree, we've got a bit of a background. I also created a castle somewhere, potentially. Here we go. We've got some walls here. So that wall section I have duplicated and created another wall. So you could repeat pattern, again, all of this. I have used the same pattern of the rocks down here with some grass on top. I even kind of drew in a little bit of a rough castle, but realized it was going to be a little bit too much. Also, that then allows me to add in a little bit of a kind of a place for him to get to. Now, what I'd also kind of want to do is show you guys a little bit of a way to add a little bit of ambiance to this. And we're going to hide this for now. I'm just going to go straight into this mode. And I've actually added in down here, I've added in this layer, this kind of gradient layer to give a sense of like mists in the foreground behind him, but in front of the background. Just adds an extra layer of kind of depth, if you will, to this. And it makes it look like there's kind of like mist in the mountains. Just gives it a little bit of atmosphere, a little bit. So how do I do this kind of dithering thing? You can see if you go up close, it kind of looks like a bit of a Christmas sweatshirt, like knitted sweatshirt pattern. What all I've done here is, let me hide this, go to my sprites and bring up this dithering tile pattern that I had right here. So all this is, basically, if you look at my kind of shapes here, is it's a nice kind of clean blocks of these kind of shepherd shapes that I've created for this. So here we've got the full color, then we've got one where there's kind of interspersed with 1 by 1, then we've got crosses, then checkerboard, and then it kind of flips to the other side, right? So all you need to do here is, with this set up, I just need to duplicate this over, merge them back together, and then I can just kind of start doubling every time I go, making sure that I've moved it over to the right side. Every time it doubles in size, and basically you're getting a nice kind of big shape of kind of dithering pattern. It gives you a bit of a gradient. Again, we don't want to reuse an extra color here. We don't want to do an actual gradient. We want to limit ourselves to 6 colors. And so that's a really good way of kind of showing different tones without having to use this actual separate color. So that's my kind of dithering done down there. And you can see, again, all it is the same color as the mountain and a few other things in here, but it gives us a nice kind of sense of a gradient. If we zoom out of this, we get a nice kind of looking impression of a gradient happening throughout. So our scene's kind of coming in together quite well. Let me add some clouds in. So these are a little bit stylized, just to give it that kind of like Japanese vibe. That's fine, they can be a little bit stylized. The problem is now these are the same color as the top of my kind of cherry blossom. So there can be some issues when you're limiting yourself with this, right? I was talking about limiting is good, but in some instances you'd want to be like, oh, well, maybe the sakura blossom can just be a shade darker to distinguish it from the cloud behind it. I did try a version where I outlined that cherry blossom to kind of separate it from the clouds in front of it, but I don't really like it that much because it kind of, I feel like it flattens my cherry blossom a little bit. Like it kind of locks it into a shape there that's not great. I could think about potentially blocking that in with a lighter color, right? Doesn't need to be full black. It could be a bit of a darker color or lighter color than that, just to give it a little bit more kind of definition again. That's possible. It's less kind of flattened, but it's still not necessarily what I wanted to be. So I'm just gonna leave it like that. The reality is if you are animating this and you are doing it as a side scroller, the movement of those kind of layers behind each other will give you that definition and will make that tree pop from the mountain behind it because they'll move at different speeds, obviously. Yeah. All right. So we're almost kind of done here. All this really needs now is a little bit of kind of that video game pizzazz. And let's get some, give him some like things to collect hanging on the wall here, so he needs to jump up. We've got a little bit of a banner that's part of the background as well. And we're also going to add in a little kind of like portrait frame, a health bar, some kind of currency that he's got, and then a timer in there as well, just to kind of round off that kind of video game screenshot vibe. His health bar is a little katana, because why not? And I've literally just duplicated the face that I created here to put him in the portrait and just put him in a square, and that's it. And by the way, again, this is where my kind of set of kind of grids here works to my advantage. That's a nice kind of 8x8 pixel, or sorry, 16x16 pixel kind of grid. Everything fits nice and clean and ready to go. Right. So we've got all the elements of our scene all colored up, ready to rock and roll. But obviously it's grayscale, so it's not very colorful, it's not a lot of fun. So what I do now, basically, is on top of this, I'm just gonna go ahead and create a very easy way to make color on top of these values, and we're going to use a gradient map. All right, so in my layer here, I'm just going to go down to this little kind of half cut circle here, go all the way down to gradient map, and I'm going to apply a gradient map, and I'm going to go in and select some colors here. Right, so I could actually go into here, let's go with some basics that's black and white, not really my jam. We could go some blues. That's not terrible, at least it's a starting point, right? Now, gradient map works in a really kind of intuitive way. If you want to think about it in this way, if I go back to my gradient map here where I've got 100% black, 100% white, it doesn't change a lot to my original artwork, just adds some contrast because as I said before, I'm not actually using full black or full white, I'm using kind of softer tones than that. But most of the work in the middle kind of stays the same. So what a gradient map is doing is it's saying, based on my tone of gray, of black to white and the grayscale in between, let me assign some colors. So here, for instance, if I click on this, on everything that's going to be on the darker range of tones, like everything that's going to be towards black, in this case, full black, I can say, well, I actually want that to be red. All right, so now we're getting this kind of tone that goes from a red to a white. So there's no more black in my thing because I've said everything that's black is actually red. Make sense? So I don't want that. I want to get a little bit of a kind of a darker blue. And so we're going to go with something like this. But we also don't want the full white there. So we're gonna go with the same kind of blue, but maybe just a very, very kind of desaturated, just off white so that it's not too kind of poking me in the eye. Now I wanna actually add some colors in between. So here it's added in a full white here, so my image is blown out massively, right? But what I can do is I can bring in a little bit, like let's say I'm gonna go with a green, right? So everything that's on that side of things is gonna be a little bit of green. And so with a few simple kind of clicks, you can get some really cool things happening because your tones are working for you and the gradient map is applying on top of that. So let's get rid of that. And I'm gonna show you guys a few different kind of gradient map tones that I have created from the get-go. So here we've got a mono color. So this is a bit of a monochromatic, except for the blue here that I'm using for the outline. So this dark blue is getting all the super dark aspects, but then everything else is just these warmer tones of oranges and kind of yellows. That's giving me a little bit of a kind of just, yeah, a monochromatic kind of look and feel, which I kind of like. It's not terrible. Or I can get in a duotone, right? So all I've done here is taken the same gradient map, but added in a blue here. So a bit of a contrast. And this acts as a bit of a kind of an offset color, gives it a little bit more kind of lift in that area. And just allows me to play around a little bit more. And if you can see here, if I double click on this and change the color of this blue, I'm gonna get something, again, equally like dramatically different. So we can do a pink, we could do a bright acid kind of yellow, we could get a very acidic kind of, very, very kind of a bit too contrasting. But you can get some really cool things happening in here. I'm also getting some muddy colors in here. So if you're really keen on your gradient maps, you can actually bring in the values of kind of where these gradients sit, and I want to make sure that there isn't that kind of dirty kind of tone that exists, and just make sure that it goes from orange straight to kind of like the blue tones a little bit more, right? It's going to give me a little bit more clarity in what I'm doing, and a little bit more options to kind of play around with that and see where all this kind of sits and what I'm going to be happy with going forward. So that's that one. Then what I've done is I've actually gone online to a website called Lospec, L-O-S-P-E-C. I'll put the link and maybe we can put this in the chat in the replay, but what this is basically it's a Game Boy color palette, right? And it's this color palette that acts with all the kind of the Game Boy screen tones, these kind of greens and like a little bit kind of khaki colors from that kind of color palette to get this kind of Game Boy screen tone in there. And then if we wanted to, if this is a little bit too saturated for you, depending on your screen, you can put in another adjustment layer on top of that and just bring down the saturation just a touch across the entire range of colors. And then we've got a full working kind of Game Boy screen setup, even though obviously it's much too wide to be a Game Boy screen, but it doesn't matter. It's just something that's going to kind of give it that little bit of an edge with that pixel art, and something that I think is quite fun to work with those kind of limited tones. But again, if you undo all of that, all you can see is this grayscale with this tones that we created that are actually really kind of simple and quite limited, right? These 5 tones, plus a 6th one for the sky background here, you can kind of see that. But generally we're working with 4, maybe 5 tones for our characters and all the assets that are in there. And then just putting on a gradient map on top of that just to make sure that we can kind of swap those color around quite easily. If I drag my thing underneath here, you can see how those tones then get affected by that kind of gradient map, right? So yeah, that's it. That's a very kind of simple way of kind of coloring. You don't have to work with grayscale if you don't want to. If you find it's kind of hindering your process, you don't have to. I only just recommend it because I feel like it's a smoother way, it's an easier way to work, and it just gives you a little bit more kind of overarching control later on of what you can do with all these different tones and kind of how your scene looks overall without having to individually pick the colors. The other thing that it means is that your values will work. Your tones and your contrast and your volumes in the artwork will work no matter what colors you put onto them, because the values of your colors are good. And that's something that's not just pixel art, by the way. That's any kind of digital painting. If your values are wrong, no amount of color is going to work, and no amount of colors, the more you put in, the more it's going to get confused and muddied. So limiting yourself, I think, is a really good idea. But yeah, that's about it. That's all the time we've got. Thanks for watching. Make sure to tune in again this time on Friday next week. I'll be going through isometric pixel art. I'll be going through a few kind of special things with that. Super fun to do. But yeah, thanks for watching. Take care and see you next week.